Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're so delighted that you're able to join us today. We've got people coming in from all over. We're going to give everyone just another minute or two to join, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, if you can drop in the chat where you're joining from, that would be great. Don't forget when you do that, that as a webinar participant on Zoom, you don't have access to video or voice, but you can connect with us via the chat. You'll want to make sure that you choose the everyone option in the chat rather than just the panelists so that we can all join in the conversation together. I'll be looking off to my right or your left a little bit just to check in and see where we have people coming in from. That's how I can see what's coming up on the chat. I see we've got a few people from California. Hello to our West Coast neighbors. And we've got some people from Canada, Saskatoon, I see there. That's awesome. More people from Denver, someone from Minneapolis. Hi, Carla. Nice to see you. A couple of Rochester folks. I have a funny story about Rochester. I have a friend who was getting a job out of college in Rochester. She assumed that it was New York, and it ended up being in Minnesota. So she was disappointed in that, but ended up having a great time in Rochester, Minnesota. It also taught her when job seeking to make sure that she read the fine print, I guess. We all make those fun mistakes coming out of college, I guess. Yes, Carla, there's a big difference between Rochester, New York and Rochester, Minnesota. It wasn't me, by the way. It truly was a friend. So one time I had somebody ask me about that story and said, was the friend you? It was not. All right, well, we've got a great group here, just about 20 people. That's awesome. I'm sure some more people will be trickling in as we go. I just want to, again, welcome everybody. My name is Julie Williamson. I'm one of the managing partners here at Karrikins Group. Together with my colleague, Bruce Siegel, we lead a team of how activators. And our how activators are people who are dedicated to figuring out how we make how matter in leadership. We believe in having a strong what, that would be your strategy, your plans, your transformation, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, and a strong why, your mission, vision, purpose. Those are important, but they're insufficient to really drive behavior change. You need to know how to lead together in order to deliver on transformation. And that's why we wanted to take a little bit of time here today on this coffee break to talk about making how matter as you activate leaders to transform your organization or your team. Before we get into the technical details, here's just a quick question for you that'll help illustrate why we think it's so important to know how you're going to lead together or how you're going to lead yourself. How many of you have ever, just by a show of hands, ever thought to yourself, gosh, I'd like to speak another language. And then you go and you download something like Babbel or Duolingo or Berlitz or some other language app. Anybody ever done that? I'm going to check out the chat and see if we have anybody who could join me in saying, yep, I've done that before. Carla, I see your hand up and a couple of others as well. It's a very common thing. It's especially common in January, by the way, as a New Year's resolution. Elise, I see you've done it too. Well, here's the thing about those language apps. They have a pretty funny curve to them. Has anybody ever been on this roller coaster relative to an app where within 30 days, your usage goes from high to low almost right away? I know that's almost exactly what happened with me. I had a trip planned down to Patagonia a couple of years ago, and I had a year before I was leaving. And I said to myself, I'm going to learn some Spanish so that, I can at least, order a meal or something down there. And oh my gosh, Carla, you have 1,067 days on Duolingo. What language are you, oh, no, that's not Carla, that's Cavell. What language are you learning? I'm so impressed by that French. Oh my gosh. Je ne parle français, but I did live in France for a little while. But that's impressive. By the way, you are a curve breaker because this curve that I'm showing you is very, very common in terms of what happens with these languages. And that's because people know what they want to do. They know why they want to do it, but they haven't figured out really how to do it within their lifestyle and how the deeply embedded habits and approaches that they have to spending their days. So even when you have a strong what, which is I want to learn a language, pretty specific, pretty measurable, pretty directive, and you have a strong why, maybe like me, you want to be able to interact with people in their native language. And you feel inspired by that, by the cultural connection to that, even with a strong what and why. If you haven't really put time into figuring out how am I going to make that a part of my day? How am I going to integrate that into my habits, in my mindset, into the factors around me? you're going to struggle to really avoid that curve that I just showed you. And Cavell, I'm so impressed, by the way, because it is really unusual to see somebody who can have a multi-year commitment to something like a Duolingo and learning a new language. So I think that's awesome. And I see Diane is offering to converse with you in French, which I love. So here's the thing about this curve is that we also see this kind of a curve replicated in transformation efforts. And I'm sure that many people here on the call have been involved in transformation efforts that have followed this curve, where everybody gets all excited, maybe in year one, maybe in quarter one. And then there's just this total drop off of energy that happens. It just craters after about the first quarter. Usually once the next quarter results are due, we see leader energy just dissipate across the board. And it's a real challenge for transformation. We all know the grim statistics that say that often over 70% of transformation efforts fail to deliver fully on their promises. And I would argue that a lot of that is because leaders don't know how to lead the transformation together as a team. They might have a very strong what in terms of transformation. They might have a very strong why, but they haven't done the work to fill in their diamond triangle and to understand how to lead together. And what I'd like to share with you today are 5 key conversations that we use in the work that we do with leaders to help them align and deliver together. And those 5 conversations are really a big part of what we call the Karrikins Group behavior model. And in the Karrikins Group behavior model, we look at what are the new outcomes that you're trying to drive. That might be your what. And then what are the decisions and behaviors that need to change in order to deliver on those outcomes? In my example with learning Spanish, which I did not do, over that whole year, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to spend maybe 30 minutes a day, kind of like Cavell, 30 minutes a day, going into the app and spending some time on it. But I didn't figure out from a decisions and behaviors perspective, how was I going to make a different decision between should I spend 30 minutes of discretionary time, I don't know, doom scrolling on Instagram, or should I go on Duolingo? Should I go for a walk, or should I go on Duolingo? Right? Like, how do I make different choices in my day in order to deliver on my what and my why? That's my how. And for leaders in transformation, we often see very clear agreement with what they want to do. And they'll say it means that we need to behave differently and make different decisions. But they don't do the upstream work in the behavior model to really figure out how are we going to do that? Because the how is embedded in 5 key influencers over our decisions and behaviors. And those are the trade-offs and blockers that we experience, and the mindsets, group dynamics, and organizational factors that play a role in how we navigate those trade-offs and blockers. So that's what we're going to dive into right now. When we think about decisions and behaviors and those outcomes, those are the new things that you want to do. It might be something like you want to drive more collaboration in your organization, or more innovation. Or it might be a major transformation, like we have an ERP system that we need to implement and we need to get going on. Those are the kinds of things that we really try and understand and lean into when we're talking about the what. And I can see the question, Patrice, that you have in here about how do you keep yourself motivated, or other leaders motivated about those blockers. And we're going to talk more about that as we go forward. So Patrice, hang in there and we'll get there. When we think about those outcomes, I'm curious for those of you on the call, what are some of the outcomes that you are trying to drive in your organization? Maybe for your team, maybe it's something that you're involved in that's a larger part of the organizational strategy. But are there new outcomes that you are trying to get to that would be helpful to think about through the lens of the behavior model? Maybe just pop it in the chat. I'll take a look over here and see what we've got coming through. If there's a specific outcome, again, it might be something general, like we need to collaborate more. It might be something specific, like we need to go to a new customer service application, or we need to roll out a new product. What's going on for all of you in terms of new outcomes that you'd like to drive for your team or in your organization? We'll just see if a couple come through. Don't be shy. Could also be a personal one. Maybe you also want to learn a new language. Susan, I see a change in focus and priorities of our business. That's a great one. You know, it's very easy often to say we have a single priority. I always go into executive teams and they're saying things like, this is our top priority. Okay, well, how are you going to make that your top priority? What decisions and behaviors need to shift? And what are the influencers that are driving the decisions and behaviors that are making that not a priority? I see, Matthew, your comment around establishing a particular group or role of leaders to be successful. So how do they shift, again, their decisions and behaviors to drive that success in a new way? Carla, I see you have a big change in your business model. Oh my gosh, a business model change is always a big change, and it's where alignment makes all the difference. We see so many business model changes going through that curve that I showed you earlier, because that gravitational pull of business as usual, the deeply embedded habits and group dynamics and organizational factors are really heavy, and they just keep pulling people back to old ways of doing business. What we often see happen, by the way, Carla, with a new business model is people just figure out how to replicate their old ways of working in the new business model. So that's something I want you to really keep an eye out for as you go forward. When you think about these new outcomes, one of the things that we really pay attention to is these trade-offs and blockers. So as leaders are needing to make new decisions and exhibit different behaviors, they have to navigate trade-offs and blockers in different ways. And Carla, I love this example of business process redesign or business model overhaul, because this is where it's really, really hard for people to start making different trade-offs because they're so used to working in the old business model. Trade-offs and blockers will always exist. There are no right answers for them. There's no right decision about whether you should make a short-term investment or a long-term investment, whether you should stick with operational reliability or try something innovative and different. There's no 100% correct answer all the time. The question leaders need to ask is, how are we navigating those trade-offs and blockers? How are we balancing, and what are the conversations that we're having that help inform us in terms of whether or not the trade-offs that we're making and the blockers that we're experiencing are in service to our goals or not in service to our goals. So it's a really big shift in the conversations that leaders need to have, rather than just focusing on, oh, well, priority A is our top priority, so we all need to work towards that. Okay, we're all going to go work towards that. And then everybody goes back to business as usual, and the priority falls to the wayside. Instead, you want to know, what are the trade-offs it's going to take to make that a priority? And what are the blockers that we need to address in order to be supportive of that priority? By starting to have conversations specifically about trade-offs and blockers, as you decide that something is an outcome that you're trying to get to, you shift the conversation in really important ways, because you start to get to the heart of what's holding you back from those outcomes. So for me, I should have gotten really honest with myself about the fact that there's a lot of things I would rather do than learn a new language. So I said it was a priority for me, but apparently my actions don't support that, because I didn't get into how do I shift my decisions and behaviors by making different trade-offs when I had discretionary time to spend. So Susan, yeah, this is a great question. What's an example of a trade-off? I would say a great example is short-term and long-term results. We see companies struggling with this all the time. So they want to make their quarterly numbers, but they also want to deliver on long-term investments. And that's a really difficult conversation. What they get stuck in is a conversation around the outcome. The outcome is, we need to make this quarter's numbers, but they don't go upstream and talk about the trade-off. If we do this, we're going to be trading off long-term success because we're so invested in our short-term outcomes. By moving the conversation up to trade-offs, you start to really shift the decisions and behaviors that leaders are making. There's a couple of other examples here on the screen. One is reliability and innovation. So a lot of times we go into clients and they'll say things like, you know what we really need? We really need more innovation around here. We need people coming up with new ideas. We need people giving us new ways of thinking. But then at the end of the day, when somebody does something innovative, the leaders pull back and they say, nope, we can't do that because it'll risk our operational reliability. We have to be able to maintain our uptime. We have to meet our customer commitments. We have to meet our financial commitments. So we can't risk being innovative. And so again, if you go upstream and start to talk about that as a trade-off, you shift the conversation away from should we or shouldn't we do something innovative, and you start to talk about how are we letting that influence our decisions and behaviors as leaders. So Susan, I hope that helps a little bit to understand this concept of trade-offs. And Chris, I see you have one in there around driving sales growth and ongoing sales support. That is an excellent one, Chris. We see that a lot, this idea of how do we drive sales growth, but also support where we are. That we see that all the time. And again, if you shift upstream and you start to say, what are the trade-offs that are influencing how we think about that particular dynamic between driving sales growth and ongoing sales support? What are the trade-offs that we're making? That becomes a very different leadership conversation than, well, we need to choose and we're going to go in one direction or another, and we're going to have to support who we have. Getting really specific about those trade-offs can be really helpful. The trick for trade-offs and blockers is to go one step even further up in the behavior model as you think about how are we navigating trade-offs and blockers, because they are absolutely influenced by the individual mindsets, the group dynamics, and the organizational factors that are playing a role in how people experience trade-offs and blockers. So if we take short-term and long-term, just by means of example, short-term and long-term outcomes, there could be a really strong mindset on the part of leaders that I'm best in service to the success of the company by making sure that my group makes their quarterly numbers. And somebody else is worrying about the long-term strategy, but I am laser focused on making sure that my group makes their quarterly numbers. And there could be a lot of reasons for that, a lot of very good reasons for that. But that will influence that leader's decisions and behaviors every time they have to make a trade-off between short-term and long-term. Now, they might be saying, I fully agree with the long-term strategy. I really hope it happens. But in the meantime, I'm best in service by making sure that my group delivers their quarterly numbers. That's just an example of how a mindset can really influence that trade-off. And again, getting upstream and talking about those mindsets and making them visible is a really powerful way to activate leaders to transform the organization. When you think, Chris, about this idea of driving sales growth and ongoing sales support, there might be an individual mindset from people about the customers we've got are really valuable and we've got to take really good care of them. And so sales support is the most important thing. And sales growth, of course, is important too, and we're going to get to it, but we've got to really prioritize sales support. I don't know, Chris, if that's a great example for you specifically. I'm just saying generally, having the conversation with people about what's your individual mindset around this? How do you think about this trade-off that we need to make on a regular basis, and starting to make those mindsets visible? It can be so powerful, and it can open up some absolutely amazing conversations about what's holding leaders back from getting to the outcomes that you're trying to get to. Likewise, with group dynamics, we see a really interesting interplay around how people are showing up together as a group, what influences the leadership team as a whole when it comes to navigating trade-offs and blockers and coming up with decisions and behaviors as a result. When we think about mindsets, just as a couple of examples, here's a few that are on the screen here. One might be, a lot of times we have a lot of clients who say, you know what we need to do is we need to collaborate more. But they have an individual mindset that is collaboration kind of takes too long and I'm not sure I get much value out of it. And so they agree in concept that an outcome is collaborating more, but they don't come up with the decisions and behaviors to do that because they have to trade off valuable time, and they have a mindset that says it's actually not that valuable. So those are the kinds of things that we start to unwind when we make these individual mindsets more visible. Alejandra, I see you have a question in here. How do you know what is the right mindset? That's a great question. You know, I don't think that I tend to qualify mindsets as being right or wrong. I think that making them visible is useful. So somebody may, in the example I just gave around collaboration, have a really deeply entrenched mindset of, I don't think collaboration is really worth my time. It doesn't pay off enough, even though I think it's a great idea. By making that visible, you can start to work with that person in a different way in terms of helping them to see opportunities where they can contribute to and gain from collaboration, and have them verbalize and have them start to get into dialogue around where is it possible that it might be valuable, rather than just trying to push a process down their throat around you need to collaborate more and here are the 7 steps you need to take, which is kind of in that what bucket. Instead, really leaning into What is holding you back from that? And how do we talk that through? How do we make that visible and work with it in a different way? So it's less that person has the wrong mindset about collaboration. Your mindset is what it is. It's valid for you. Is there an opportunity to shift that mindset into something that will drive you towards the outcomes that you say you agree are important to get to? Diane, I see you have a comment in here. If I focus too much on my own area of success, this will have a direct impact on the organization. Yeah, absolutely. Remembering we're all a team and looking for the same end result. I think that's really beautifully said. And that's a wonderful mindset to go into this idea of we are a leadership team that is leading together, not I'm a leader who's leading just in my area. That idea of horizontal leadership and seeing the whole board is really what unlocks transformation. By having the conversation about individual mindsets, you can start to get into where are people blocking themselves or making maybe not so productive trade-offs because they're really laser focused on their own area, or maybe they're not seeing the whole picture. They're not connecting across the business. And you can help activate them in the transformation by having that conversation and getting them to be honest about the mindsets that they're bringing into the trade-offs and blockers that they're navigating. So yeah, I think mindsets are great to give voice to. They're often invisible. It can be uncomfortable for people to really talk honestly about the mindsets that they bring in. But if as a leader, you can create a safe space for them to have that conversation, unbelievable power gets unlocked across the leadership team. Speaking of across the leadership team, we have group dynamics as well. And these group dynamics are often rituals or patterns or ways of working or behaviors that we see as a group. So just like we individually get deeply habituated into our decision making, groups get really deeply habituated into the decisions that they make and how they behave. So there's some examples here on the screen. Sometimes it's things like defaulting to the same people or 2 or 3 people who are always maybe taking a meeting off track and getting into their own specific issues, or different ways in which a leadership team is spending time together can really impact the outcome of wanting to transform the organization or the team. I'm thinking, by the way, about the business model conversation and the idea of wanting to get into a new business model. That transformation is so challenging. And it's also really powerful when the leaders who are trying to lead through that outcome to that outcome are starting to talk about their own group dynamics and how their group dynamics need to change in order to get to a new business model. I always say that leaders love to change other people, but they don't love to change themselves. And that's especially true, by the way, when it comes to business models. But if the leaders aren't transforming how they're leading as a leadership team, and that's in that group dynamic space, then they're not going to be able to get themselves into a new business model, much less anybody else. So figuring out how leaders need to transform is really important when you're talking about retooling the business and going through any kind of major transformation. Again, getting to visibility and dialogue around group dynamics, it can be really challenging for people. It feels kind of weird, and it can feel, maybe like, oh, this should be team building. It actually has nothing to do with team building. It has to do with how are we working together and how are we leading together and how do our group dynamics inform how as a team we face off against trade-offs and blockers that lead to decisions and behaviors that we make that deliver on the outcomes that we ultimately want to deliver on. So again, great conversation is something that a lot of leadership teams don't get into, but it's really important to have this conversation if you want to activate your leaders to successfully lead transformation as a team. We like to say that there's an old expression that says, to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. And we like to say, to go fast, far, get aligned, and do it as a team. And that's really what the power of these conversations unlocks, is the ability to say, here's my individual mindset. Here are the group dynamics that are coming into play. Here are the things that are influencing how I show up when I hit trade-offs and blockers, or how we show up when we hit trade-offs and blockers, and therefore the decisions and behaviors that we exhibit, and ultimately the outcomes that we deliver. The last item in the influencers that I wanted to talk about has to do with organizational factors. Now, I have to tell you, when we're doing this work with teams, everybody breathes a sigh of relief when we get to organizational factors, because this is where leaders love to spend their time. But it's actually not the most important of the influencers. because organizational factors are things like, I don't know, the organizational design, the compensation model. It could be processes that you use. It could be the ERP platform that you're on. It could be a lot of things that are just organizationally. It could be the organizational model, by the way, where there's like a holding company and sub-companies, or P&L, or geographies, or it could be that you have multiple time zones and languages you're navigating. These are all just organizational realities that play a role in how you navigate trade-offs and deal with blockers and ultimately make decisions. The challenge is that organizational factors are not the solution to changing decisions and behaviors on the part of leaders that ultimately drive outcomes. Those are really embedded in the individual mindsets and group dynamics that are often invisible. And that's why we encourage teams in the work that we do to spend a lot of time unpacking those individual mindsets and group dynamics, and also making trade-offs visible in different ways. When you do that work, the organizational factors become less of a pressure point for how you show up when you're trying to make decisions. Now, organizational factors often are things also that you can't do anything about. Sometimes they're just a reality. It might be a regulatory environment, regulatory requirement. It might be a market factor. There's all sorts of ways that organizational factors put pressure on leaders to make certain decisions. But if you can really get clear on the individual mindsets and group dynamics, you start to be able to manage organizational factors in new and different ways, which is really powerful for leadership teams. And it's unbelievably powerful when you're going through transformation. So organizational factors is the third influencer on that far left. Goes in with the 5 influencers that include trade-offs and blockers, but it's actually not where we spend most of our time as we think about how can you get leaders to activate themselves to transform by changing their decisions and behaviors. So that's a very quick walkthrough of our behavior model. And we think about these 5 conversations as being really a key component of activating leaders to transform the organization. Remember, you're talking about trade-offs and blockers. Those are things that get right in the way of decisions and behaviors that are trying to drive outcomes. And then out of that, we see influencers around that as being individual mindsets, group dynamics, and then last but not least, organizational factors that are realities that everybody has to grapple with. In our experience, these are often very new conversations for leadership teams that are struggling with transformation. So as you go down the route of trying to transform your business model, or trying to go to a new sales model, or change your go-to-market, whatever it might be, whatever the transformation is that you're doing with your team or your organization, having these 5 conversations can absolutely alter the trajectory and keep you out of that drop-off and into what we call a successful simmer as you continue to maintain the energy of leaders across the board. I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions that you want to pop in the chat, or anything else that I can offer before we wrap this up. We promised 30 minutes of a coffee break. Hopefully you've had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or something interesting for yourself during this time, and you've picked up some good ideas or thoughts about how you might be able to support your team or your organization's transformation by opening some new conversations around these influencers, and also how you get to how we're going to lead this together as you work to complete your diamond triangle. Any questions or comments in the chat before we wrap this up? Looks like we've got a quiet group out there, so we're going to stay on for just a couple of minutes, but we'll go ahead and shut this down. And I'm going to say thank you very much for your engagement and your time. I really appreciate it. We would love to say hi. We're also going to send out a follow-up email, so you'll have a copy of the recording, and there's a summary of all of the content that will come in that PDF as well. So watch in your email for that. Feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to chat about any transformation work that you have going on in your organization. And we will hope that you have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.